this video. I'm joined here today with Joseph Ben-Ami from the Arthur Meehan Institute and Matt Bufton from the Institute for Liberal Studies, True Liberal Studies, I believe he would say. So today we're going to discuss marijuana, and I believe you're both going to come at it from a libertarian perspective. And the question that we're dealing with in particular is the question of legalization, decriminalization, or criminalization, all out ban on the use of marijuana. We're probably going to get much more nuanced in the discussion, but I will also interject with questions throughout, and I'll be coming at it more from a Christian perspective, a Reformed Christian perspective. And I understand both of you are coming from a non-religious or a non-sectarian perspective. So I guess the question is, where do you stand, to open it up, Joseph, where do you stand on marijuana? Should the government of Canada be legalizing it? If so, how far, how much, or should it remain criminalized?
Well, I kind of like the laws that we have as they stand now. I think that marijuana, I more than think, I think research supports the contention that marijuana is a dangerous drug, that its regular and or long-term use has harmful effects, principally amongst adolescents, which is the time when people generally use these kinds of drugs, start using them. So I believe that as a matter of general principle, I think that society, using government as its agent, has the right to set standards of behavior, to regulate certain behaviors, and to impose penalties when you stray outside of that. Should everything be criminal? Should people go to jail for simple possession of marijuana or for using it recreationally from time to time? Well, that's a fair question. Where do we draw the line? Where do we start to impose criminal sanctions on people and penalties? But I think that we have a pretty good criminal justice system here that is fairly sensible, that gives the courts and judges the opportunity to exercise discretion in the application of the law.
Matt, what do you think? Should our laws stay the way they are, or do we need to change?
No, I think we need to change. And actually, I'll thank Joseph for getting this conversation started off. Make sure it's something to talk about, because I disagree with almost everything that he said in his opening, which is good, because nobody wants to watch us sit here and agree for an hour or so. But I will say that, first of all, I believe that all drugs should be legalized as a libertarian, and that certainly includes marijuana, which is going to be the focus of our discussion this afternoon. I think right now we've got an interesting sort of situation legally in Canada. Joseph described the situation where, to a large extent, in law, we have a prohibition, a criminalization of marijuana. But in fact, we have a decriminalization. As you mentioned, you're almost not going to, it's almost impossible for you to go to jail for personal possession, although it does set up the situation where a police officer can threaten you with these things sort of arbitrarily. And so maybe he's not going to lock you up if you throw away the joint down the drain when he tells you to, but if you swear at him, he decides he can take you in. And that introduces a level of sort of discretion among police officers that I don't think is great in a justice system. So I do think that we'd be better off with a formal decriminalization rather than sort of the informal decriminalization that we've had. But further than that, I believe that we'd be better off with a legalization. Part of that is because it's a bit of a weird situation for the law to say it's okay to smoke it if we go to a decriminalization. And essentially now, many police officers and even judges will acknowledge that it's okay to smoke marijuana. But you're not allowed to grow it or to sell it. Well, then how do you get it? How does anyone end up smoking it? And to address the concerns that you mentioned, and I think those are legitimate concerns, we probably don't want a lot of 13 and 14-year-olds walking around and smoking marijuana. I think the better way to get to that point is the way we treat alcohol, the way we treat tobacco. These are legal products that do have some sensible restrictions to them.
So if I can interact with what both of you have said, I'll start with Joseph. You mentioned that there is a legitimate role for the government to try to control certain behaviors, and that certain behaviors are unacceptable, and if you step outside the bounds, that the government has a role, the civil government has a role to punish that kind of behavior. I guess when it comes to marijuana, many people from a Christian perspective might totally agree that smoking marijuana, getting high, is a sin, but they have trouble seeing sin as necessarily being a crime. Not all sin is crime. So how do we deal with that objection?
You're really introducing the subject of what role the government has to play in quote-unquote imposing morality on the rest of society, or one definition of morality. I tend to confuse theology with morality, okay? I'm obviously a religious person. I have my own theological beliefs. I don't think that religion as theology ought to be mixed with politics. I don't think that that's a good mix. I don't think that any particular religious group has the right to use the blunt instrument of government to impose a particular theological point of view on people. But morality is a separate question altogether. Morality is a question of right versus wrong in general, generically speaking, if you will. And to the degree that all laws are predicated on the belief that certain things are wrong and certain things are right, and that from time to time we should be able to proscribe behavior, or from time to time we should be able to prescribe behavior on any subject. To the degree that we're talking about right versus wrong, all laws are based on morality, okay? And so the argument that we shouldn't be imposing morality on people isn't an argument against any particular law or set of laws, it's an argument against all laws. So we have to really fine-tune the argument. We have to look at why we take the positions that we take. We have to have different criteria and move away from the separate question of whether or not, is it sinful.
So I agree with your statement about morality. I mean, all laws are moral. The tax code is a moral document. I would agree with that. Some writers, some Christian writers would say, well, there's a difference between interpersonal crime or interpersonal behavior and intra or infra-personal crime or behavior. So, and they would argue that interpersonal behavior can be criminalized, theft, rape, murder. All of these things are crimes of one person against another person, and there the government has a right to intervene. But when we're talking about the use of marijuana, cannabis, or whatever, there that's a personal crime where the victim is the same person as the perpetrator in a sense. So does that change your perspective? Does that change the rules here?
Yeah, and again, we're really starting to fine-tune, I think, the question a little bit. I think it's important to separate the production and the distribution, the marketing side of producing drugs in general, and marijuana, because that's the focus of this discussion, from the personal use, okay? The problem is that when it comes time to producing and selling the drug, okay, and let's be clear, marijuana, contrary to what people say, okay, is absolutely, unequivocally, demonstrably harmful, okay? But the problem here is not, Andre, it's not the personal use, it's the production and the distribution of it, okay? And so if we take the position, including, a libertarian position, that the government has a role in preventing harm to people, okay, or punishing people who harm other people, then we see that there is actually a role for government to intervene here. So it's not just that somebody says, well, I'm just hurting myself, so who cares? The other part of that, I think, is important to remember that by far and away the majority of people who use the drug, who get started in using marijuana in particular, are teens. And we all know that teens, with the greatest of respect to the whole adolescent community that some of whom might be listening or watching this video now, right, don't exercise generally good judgment. And biologically, they're not capable of it, because the adolescent brain is not fully developed, okay, the human brain is not fully developed cognitively, judgmentally, until their early 20s. So the people who are arguing for being able to make this personal choice are people who, by definition, aren't capable of making that informed choice. So it's not as simple as those who take the position you just articulated. It's not as simple as that.
Okay. Matt, do you have any thoughts on what Joseph just articulated?
Yeah, first of all, I'll push back gently on the claim that marijuana isn't inherently harmful. I'm not an expert on this. The literature I've read, I've seen studies claiming it both ways. I think it's probably true that excessive use, as with alcohol, is going to have some effects, and perhaps age factors into this. So there's good reason to think that if we're going to make marijuana legal, we would treat it like alcohol. Say you would be 19 or 18 to be able to purchase it. I'll push back a bit on the decision making, that I concede your point that teens and young people don't have a fully developed cognitive system the way that adults do. I don't think it follows that they are not capable of making this decision or any decision. There's a lot of decisions that are capable of making. They might not make them quite as well as they would when they were 10 years older. But where I really want to push back is on the libertarian idea, which is that the government does not have a role in protecting you from yourself. I'd probably be a healthier, better off person if I never ate a Big Mac and I got up at 5:30 a.m. and went jogging. The problem is I like to have Big Macs once in a while. I don't like to get up at 5:30 a.m. I definitely don't like to go jogging. So while I might be better off if I did all those things, I wouldn't be happier. And so with the libertarian idea is that I get to decide, so long as I'm not demanding that anyone else or inflicting or violating anyone else's rights, I get to make those decisions. And if I were a person who wanted to smoke marijuana, so long as I weren't harming anyone else, the libertarian would say, go for it.
Right. If we concede the point that there is harm in marijuana and that it's higher than cigarette use, if we concede that point for the sake of argument, if for no other reason, you would say, well, it doesn't really matter anyway because the government doesn't have a role in telling me what I can and cannot do with my own body. So I guess to push a little bit on that, in our current society, in Canadian society with a public health care system and so on, are we putting the cart before the horse when we're saying legalize drugs, who cares what it's going to do to my body, because in the end of the day, everybody else, the taxpayer, is going to have to pay for my schizophrenia treatments or whatever.
No, I don't think so. And part of it is, and similar to what Joseph was saying, but sort of flipping the arguments, that's an argument against public health care, against this funding of health care in the model that we currently use. But also, I don't think it's fair to say, oh, I'm going to do something that's harmful and who cares? Because even if if I eat 3 Big Macs every day, and I just become really obese and in very poor health, I could take the attitude of, oh, who cares? You guys are going to pay for it anyway. But if I weigh 400 pounds and I have trouble moving and my knees are giving out, even if I can get free replacements, it's a big inconvenience for me. It's not something that I'm just going to not care about.
Right. Some people have used libertarian arguments or the idea of liberty to argue for license to do all kinds of things or get all kinds of things. And this week in particular, it's been brought to my attention that this issue is real for many Christians, Christian doctors in particular, when it comes to the drug of the birth control pill. You may have heard that there are some doctors in Canada that for conscientious reasons will not prescribe the birth control pill. And yet there's a big outcry that's saying, I have a right to birth control and I demand that whichever doctor I see will give me my birth control. Is it going to be the same thing with marijuana, where we're now going to see people demanding that if marijuana is legalized, I have a right to use it, I can use it whenever I want, and if you're an employer and you don't want to hire me because I'm a pothead, well, I'm going to go to the Human Rights Tribunal and make sure you have to let me work, or you can't discriminate against me because I happen to smoke marijuana. Is that something that's going to happen? Should we legalize?
It may happen, but I don't think it's strongly connected to the question of whether we should legalize or not. I'm familiar with the case you're talking about, and I think this is a great illustration of the tensions between negative and positive rights, which is the distinction that Isaiah Berlin uses. That can get a bit difficult conceptually. P.J. O'Rourke, the American humorist, uses the distinction of give me rights or get out of here rights. So if you're claiming a right to marijuana and you're saying you have to give me marijuana, you're making a positive claim. So you've got to give me marijuana. Whereas if you're just saying I should be allowed to smoke marijuana and you should be able to come and stop me, that's a negative right, that's a get out of here right. So it's, again, with anything, it's possible that we're going to get this confusion, but I don't think the making marijuana legal or criminalized or whatever we do, that's not going to be what decides that. That's a different conversation that I think is important for us to have in society, but it also is separate.
Okay. So I've got a question again for Joseph. I've got here a chapter from a book called Towards a Worldwide Index of Human Freedom. It was put out by the Fraser Institute. And chapter 10 is called From Fighting the Drug War to Protecting the Right to Use Drugs. And it's written by Doug Bando, who I believe is also a Christian, though he does not write from a Christian perspective here necessarily, definitely not explicitly anyway. But he talks about the costs of drug prohibition. And here he says, and I'll just read the quote and then just ask for your thoughts on it. Here he says, banning drugs raises their price, creates enormous profits for criminal entrepreneurs, thrusts users into an illegal marketplace, encourages users to commit property crimes to acquire higher priced drugs, leaves violence the only means to settle disputes within the drug trade, forces government to spend lavishly to curtail drug sales and use, and results in widespread corruption of public officials and institutions. Another point he makes later on in the paper is that by criminalizing drug production, not only use, but also production, distribution, and so on, it focuses scarce police resources or justice resources on something like drug use or drug creation, and not shifting it elsewhere. So for example, when I was in doing my law degree here at University of Ottawa, in the forensic law department or class that I took, one of the police officers came in and did a seminar on internet crime, in particular child luring. And he said that they could catch 10 times the amount of pedophiles and child, those who are targeting children over the internet if they just had the resources. So combining those two thoughts, I guess, is drug production, the distribution of drugs and marijuana in particular, is it a good use of our resources as a government when there are other crimes that presumably are more important and need resources as well?
When we have this discussion, the allocation of resources, and we talk about the criminal or the not promotion, but the enticement or the consequences of criminalizing things, the higher prices, the violence, etc. Absent from that equation, in all cases, is a discussion about the criminal trade, the illegal trade in legal drugs, which is just as much a problem. And in many states in the United States, as a matter of fact, the illegal trade in prescription drugs is actually bigger than the illegal trade in illegal drugs. I guess the point I'd be making here is that what we lose sight of is the fact that the cause of criminal behavior, okay, the reason the drugs are more expensive, the reason that there's violence, isn't because these particular drugs are illegal or prohibited. It's because you can make money doing it, and if you do it illegally, okay, these things happen. Whether it's marijuana or it's anything else, okay, is not going to take away the criminal element. And I have yet to see any kind of an authoritative study that supports that contention. So it's, in my view, it's a bit of a myth.
I've heard many people arguing for the legalization of drugs. One of the reasons being, well, it'll totally cut the legs out from under the big drug gangs and so on. Is that a myth?
No, I mean, I don't think so at all. And I think it's great to address this. Earlier on, I was talking about sort of a bit more of a natural rights of libertarian perspective, but I should be able to put what I want in my body. Now, this is a great example of consequentialist libertarian argument. So we're here looking at what is the greater good. And so acknowledging that there is some harm that's caused by the use of marijuana, we're now saying, let's look at the harm caused on the other side. And while I take there's a grain of truth in what Joseph says, you're never going to get rid of this illegal behavior altogether with anything that's regulated. I think you're going to drastically reduce it. I think if you want to look at that, you can compare what we see as far as the marijuana trade, as far as criminality, violence, and all that sort of stuff, versus what we see in the illegal tobacco trade. So there are people, because of the heavy taxes and regulations on tobacco cigarettes, that smuggle those, that sell those illegally. That is much, much smaller in terms of what the entire tobacco market is than what marijuana violence is compared to the marijuana market. So I think just by doing the legalization of production and sale Sure, we would probably still have some contraband. There might be some crime related to marijuana, but I think it'd be much, much smaller, much less violent, and most importantly, far, far fewer people getting killed in the crossfire, as we see sometimes in the U.S.
There's a legal philosopher named Michael Sandel from Harvard or Yale in the States, and he talks about the moral limits of markets. Your statement that the government does have a legitimate role in protecting vulnerable people, perhaps not from themselves, but certainly from others who might prey on them or take advantage of them. From a Christian perspective, Romans 13 talks about the role of the government, and that is to punish the bad and to protect those who do good. And so I think that's a compelling question. I'm wondering, Matt, if you can speak to it. Those who produce the drugs market it perhaps with an evil animus, with an intent to try to get people hooked so that they continue to buy their product. Does the government not have an obligation to protect people from that type of activity?
Not in this, so long as people know what they're sort of getting into. Although that may make it sound a bit more nefarious than that I intend to. But a good example of this is the fact that the way in which policy and our laws about these drugs shape the way they're consumed. So a lot of people, we're in Ottawa right now, a lot of people in the city have a caffeine addiction. Now when you look at caffeine chemically, it's very similar to cocaine, to the point that if you were to be consuming a gram of pure caffeine every day, the effects would be very, very similar to if you were consuming a gram of pure cocaine. And also a pound of coffee beans has enough caffeine in there to kill you. If you were able to extract all of that caffeine and put it into your body, that would kill you. Because of the fact that coffee is legal and it's no problem to ship giant containers full of coffee beans across the border and roast them, and we consume it in a much, much more diluted quantity than we do an illegal drug. As soon as it's illegal, you want to get the smallest amount possible, and that's why you see these little bricks of cocaine. They're worth huge amounts, and people tying up condoms full of cocaine and swallowing them, trying to get them across that way.
So let me interrupt you just along those lines. I apologize for the interruption, but that's a really interesting perspective I hadn't heard before. So my question would be then that if I were then to decide that I wanted to distill coffee, to extract the caffeine from it and to sell it in a very concentrated form that we all knew was going to be highly addictive and life-threatening, okay? Does the government not have a role then to step in and say, no, you can't do that? And let's say it's just a regulatory rule, and I ignore those regulations, and I do it anyway, and I'm harming people who are making informed choices. Does the government not have the right to does society, I should say, using the government as agent, in a case like that, not have the right to say, no, you can't do that, and if you do that, then we're going to fine you, we're going to put you in jail, we're going to punish you somehow?
I don't think so, and I have to say that I get my caffeine through coffee and tea. I'm not sure that caffeine pills are legal in Canada and Ontario, but I think they are. I think you can go to some stores and just buy a very concentrated bit of caffeine. And if it's not legal, then certainly people can buy them in other jurisdictions. And I do know people who have these pills. They're driving long distances. They want to stay up and study. Some people do that. So I'd say, first of all, no, I don't think the government needs to step in or should step in or has a right to step in and stop them from doing that. But second of all, I'll point out how small a market that is. We've got close to 1 million people in Ottawa. I'm going to guess if you added up how many people consumed coffee or tea this morning, you'd probably be looking at getting close to half of the population. If you asked how many people had a caffeine pill this morning, I think you'd be looking at a pretty vanishingly small number of people. And this just shows the ways people do enjoy consuming substances and drugs that alter their perception, alter their chemical brain activity. But very few people want a great big dramatic shift. A lot of people want a small shift, such as they would get from a cup of coffee in the morning or a beer or a glass of wine when they get home in the evening.
We wrap this up, and that is the question of which sphere of society do you think would be the best to deal with these kinds of questions? And I already think I know the answer, but again, from a reformed Christian perspective, we recognize a very limited role for the government, that is to protect the good and to punish those who are doing wrong. But then there's other spheres which also have a lot of influence and responsibility given to them by God. The family being a very important one, training children how to live their lives, the right decisions to make. So maybe don't do drugs would be one of those. The church preaches on what is sin and what is not. Do those other spheres have a role? And if they do their role when it comes to the question of drugs, do you think that we need government interfering?
I think that in all of the areas that you've just discussed, articulated, and many more, I think that the first line of defense, if I could use that terminology, is the family. I think that the family is the place where children learn behavior, they see behavior modeled. What astonishes me is that fiscal conservatives or free market advocates, too many tend to ignore the role of the family in rearing good citizens and teaching them good work habits, frugal living, fiscal responsibility. I mean, this is where we learn to live, is in the family. And I think that you can't separate the breakdown of the family from the kinds of financial, larger economic issues that we have to face every day in this country and other countries around the world, and in just in terms of criminal behavior and with respect to drug use as well. Having said that, I do believe, once again, that there is a role for government to play, for society writ large to play, at using the government as its agent to backstop what the family does, and to step in to create and enforce rules that support and enhance what the role of the family is in the first place. Remember, the opposite of totalitarianism is not liberty. The opposite of totalitarianism is anarchy. And so we do have to have rules, and we all agree on that. And I think that's actually a good point to make at this stage. We're arguing largely degrees here. We're arguing nuance. Some of them are pretty big degrees, maybe. But ultimately, I don't think any of us thinks that there isn't a role for government to play in creating a framework and protecting that framework within which we can all live free lives according to our lights and to the best of our abilities.
Final comment to you, Matt.
Just to say that I think Joseph made some great points in the first half of the statement about the role of the family and the importance, and that's something we can definitely agree on. A third sort of libertarian reason to oppose the drug war is just to look at effectiveness. And we say, look, governments can't do this. The classic example is that we have maximum security prisons in this country, and we can't keep drugs, marijuana, anything outside of those prisons. So we could turn the whole country into a maximum security prison, and we still couldn't stop people from getting and doing drugs. The best chance we have if we want to stop people from getting and doing drugs is to make them not want them. And that's a great role for the family, that's a great role for civil society, and these are ways that we can step outside of the government paradigm and get the results that we want.
Great. Thank you very much, Joseph. Thank you, Matt, for taking the time to chat with us about this issue, and I wish you all the best in your work as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much.